now it's the turn of my old friend, Professor Bruce Evans. We've worked together off and on for quite a number of years. He's going to talk about diagnosis of visual stress. He's professor of he's a director of research at the Institute of Optometry in London. Bruce.
Thank you very much, Arnold, and thank you for organising today and for inviting me to speak. So I should disclose that I've received funding from a variety of organisations, and I'm not really trying to plug anything today. The exercises I developed are not mentioned today, and the binocular vision book, which was published this year, is not that relevant to the talk. So here's a plan for the talk. What I think the problem's been in terms of diagnosis, the diagnostic criteria that we currently tend to work with, differential diagnosis of visual stress, and then some comments about what I think are unresolved questions. So to move on first to the problem, one of the problems is that when children are asked whether a coloured filter helps, it may in some cases be what we call visual stress, but it may also be other things that explain an apparent benefit from coloured filters. So all optometrists will know the chromatic aberration effect, whereby people with certain refractive errors like long-sightedness will find green backgrounds or colours clearer, and those who are myopic will find red clearer. But this chromatic aberration would also mean that children with accommodative problems will sometimes benefit from a certain coloured filter. And for similar reasons, people with ocular alignment problems like decompensated heterophoria may benefit from a certain colour. There may be a photophobia from a pathology, for example, such as uveitis, that could mean people benefit from filters generally. And there may, particularly in children, but also in adults, be other reasons in grey here why people might choose a certain colour. It may be a placebo attributional effect, or of course it may be a favourite colour, which obviously will have in some children a gender effect. So what this means is that if we're going to look at why coloured filters seem to help some people, we need to make sure that we are looking at people with visual stress. And when you look at the literature, you'll find that studies that tend to conclude that coloured filters are not helpful will often not be designed well to look at the target condition. So, for example, we know nowadays that probably about 1 in 5 children with reading difficulties like dyslexia have visual stress. So if you look at a relatively small sample of dyslexics and say, do coloured filters help them? You probably won't think they will, because only 1 in 5 of that small sample will actually have visual stress. You need to study people with visual stress. And researchers that have studied broader populations and have not selected for visual stress tend to conclude that coloured filters don't work. Here's a study I was involved in. I'm going to be critical of myself as well. We were quite broad in this study. We just looked at people who said that coloured filters help. And of course, you're going to get people with these conditions in, as well as people with genuine visual stress. So we know that we need to do a better job nowadays of selecting our study population. And I would also add criticism here that perhaps Erland's diagnostic criteria are too broad as well. They've argued that 77% of poor readers have visual stress. I think it's far fewer than that. Another pitfall in researching visual stress, in my opinion, is when studies don't allow for a degree of precision. For example, if you just looked at blue or red or blue or yellow coloured filters, I think you would probably find they were not very effective, whereas if you'd prescribed coloured filters with more precision, you'd get more benefit. We know that visual stress tends to affect reading when children look at smaller text. And that's why that's the case will be very apparent from the earlier presentations this afternoon. But what that means is if you look at whether coloured filters help in visual stress using large text, you probably won't find a benefit in the way that you would if you use small text. Now, these pitfalls account, I think, for some of the negative findings in the literature. And they also, in my view, explain some of these systematic reviews that have not used appropriate selection criteria, so have not really controlled for these variables, and therefore have included some of these studies that I think used inappropriate selection criteria, inappropriate diagnostic criteria. And therefore, the systematic reviews that have not been as selective as they should have been will find that coloured filters are not as effective as more selective reviews would have found. And this has led to controversy in the field. And to give an example of this, in 2016, there were 2 systematic reviews published, the one by Peter Allen and myself, and one by Griffiths and colleagues. And our systematic review looked at studies that had selected for visual stress. The other review didn't. And our conclusions were that visual stress exists and coloured filters seem to help in visual stress, whereas the other review felt that coloured filters as a therapy could not be endorsed. Now, both reviews agreed on a couple of things. They both agreed that we need more large-scale randomized controlled trials. And before you can do that, both reviews agreed that we needed better diagnostic criteria. And this talk really is about this first stage. And to be fair to people who have researched visual stress without selecting a population with visual stress, if there's not a great deal of clarity about the diagnostic criteria for visual stress, you can't really blame them. So to look at diagnostic criteria, Peter Allen, Arnold Wilkins and I carried out a Delphi study. Nothing to do with the Oracle at Delphi, although it would be nice to have consulted that. But a Delphi study is where you look at experts and you survey them repeatedly for what they are doing. So we picked some of the most common, some of the top prescribers of precision tinted lenses in the UK. And we had 2 rounds where we sent them questions and then refined questions to find out what they were using as diagnostic criteria. Now, the interesting thing is that we got some surprises. Some of these things that they told us were things that we taught on courses, so they perhaps weren't surprising, but these prescribers of precision tinted lenses had gone beyond what we've been teaching for years, and they had come up with some ideas in diagnosis that had moved ahead of what we'd taught and published before. So the conclusions from this Delphi study were that we think somebody has genuine visual stress or is likely to have genuine visual stress when they have at least 3 of these 6 typical symptoms: words moving, merging, seeing patterns or shadows in the text, a bit like something Gordon Plant mentioned, text appearing to come off the page, words or letters fading or darken, and discomfort with certain artificial lights. And as well as having 3 of these 6 symptoms, they are required also to meet 2 of these 3 clinical signs of visual stress. So 2 of these are about overlay use, but the third, the pattern glare test, is independent of colour. And that's quite important in terms of a diagnostic criterion. So these are the diagnostic criteria pieced together from this Delphi study. And that takes us to the differential diagnosis, because the College of Optometrists, in their guidance for clinical practice, stress that before a practitioner reaches a diagnosis of visual stress, so before they prescribe precision tinted lenses, they should explore other visual problems that could be the cause of these symptoms. And these other optometric problems have been researched, and several studies have found that people who complain of the symptoms of visual stress that we identified in the Delphi study, for example, sometimes those symptoms can be explained not by visual stress, but by binocular vision and accommodative anomalies, summarized as BVA on this slide. And for some of these people, visual stress may be helpful. And we think that it's uncommon that these binocular vision and accommodative anomalies are the sole cause of the symptoms of visual stress, but they're definitely worth looking for before coloured filters are prescribed. And indeed, so are other conditions. And I've published over the years a few case studies of conditions that have been by teachers, patients, parents, conditions that have been misdiagnosed as visual stress. So people that have arrived at the optometrist thinking they need coloured filters, and in fact they don't. In fact, it's a much more conventional condition that needs treatment. So this has led really to this sort of diagnostic pathway, that if people describe perceptual difficulties with text that maybe a teacher thinks of visual stress, I would argue that they should see an optometrist who should check the eye health. It might be an ophthalmologist, of course, as well. They should also have refractive errors looked for. They should also have their orthoptic status, their binocular vision and their accommodation tested, typically by optometrists or orthoptists. And I would argue that part of this workup should also be at the detection of the Delphi criteria for visual stress. Now, a difficulty with this pathway is that diagnostic criteria for refractive errors and binocular vision anomalies are themselves vague. And particularly in the States, they do a very large battery of tests of binocular function that, of course, the larger the battery of tests you do, the more likely it is that you will find an anomaly. The other point that I would make is maybe one day in the future, we will look back at this pathway and we will say maybe the hierarchy was wrong. How can a patient have the normal binocular vision and accommodation that we say they need to have if they have visual stress that's causing unstable visual perception? They have visual stress that's making words appear to blur and move on the page in a sensory way, then that will interfere with the feedback loop that's required for accurate accommodation and binocular alignment. So maybe in the fullness of time, we will look at this in a slightly different sequence, and we'll be saying that the Delphi criteria should perhaps be looked at before the binocular vision and the accommodation are assessed. But at the moment, of course, we need to do things in a conservative way and do the conventional first and follow the College of Optometrists guidance is the best advice. So I'll finish really by raising a few questions that I don't think we have answers to, quite frankly. Firstly, in the Delphi study, we came up with diagnostic criteria based on what clinicians are doing at the moment, the most experienced clinicians prescribing precision tinted lenses, but we haven't yet really validated those. And we think they're sensible, but it would be nice if they were being researched in a more experimental way. These criteria were developed for children with reading difficulties because in the UK, the most common use of precision tinted lenses is for children with the symptoms of visual stress who have reading difficulties like dyslexia. This raises questions, though, about the other cases of visual stress, because visual stress co-occurs with reading difficulties, but it also co-occurs with autism, migraine, visual snow, as you've heard, cluster headache, perhaps epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, stroke. So really, we need to think about visual stress and its diagnosis in these conditions as well. And should it be diagnosed in the same way? Well, the Delphi criteria that I showed you, of course, relate mostly to text. So I think those criteria are only going to be appropriate in cases where at least part of the symptoms that person reports are to do with text. And similarly, the differential diagnosis of visual stress that I've talked about mostly relates to children with reading problems, and again, is probably only relevant for text. Deacon Hall and I, a number of years ago, published a few times on the visual correlates of migraine. And some of those are binocular vision or accommodative problems, but there are questions about whether those are also associated with these other conditions. And perhaps of most interest to this audience, thinking about research and visual stress, we desperately need randomized controlled trials of visual stress, and larger ones than we've had before. The question then is, do we want one big randomized controlled trial that looks at a mixture of people whose common underlying condition is visual stress, but who have different associated conditions? Or does each of these conditions, when associated with visual stress, require its own randomized controlled trial? So I'm sorry to leave you with more questions than answers, but I think that's where we are. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that thoughtful foray into diagnosis.
Thank you, Bruce. And whilst we have you, Bruce, for the Delphi criteria, is the patient asked the 6 questions, or are they just asked to tell me about your reading?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would do both. So I would start by asking the child what they see when they look at a page of text. And all optometrists, I think, ask any patient whether text appears blurred. I would always, with any child that I see, even if they've not come to me because of suspected visual stress, I would always say, when you look at words, do they ever appear to move around or jumble on the page or blur? Because so often we say, when you look at words, are they clear? And they are clear some of the time, but at other times the words may go blurred or they may move around, and it's worth specifically asking, I think, that question. So I would firstly ask open questions. What does the child see when they look at text? And then I would ask more closed questions and run through the Delphi list just to see how many of those symptoms they report.
Great, thank you. And Arnold, I have one for you. Was there any difference in reaction to coloured overlays noticed in red-green colourblind individuals?
Well, the curious thing is that no, simple answer. The curious thing is that the incidence of colour anomaly in those who visually suffer visual stress is just about what you'd expect in the general population. So wouldn't you agree, Bruce? You're welcome to, you probably know more about it than I do.
No, just to agree with you, we've looked at this in a few studies and we haven't found anything unusual about the prevalence of colour vision defects in people with visual stress.
Yeah.
Many thanks. I have another question that's just in to Bruce. It says, what if there's not a problem with printed text, but the white background surrounding the text stands and overwhelms that text?
Yeah, and some individuals do characterize their symptoms of visual stress in that way, as you know, the background's just so bright. And often they've discovered that colored paper makes a big difference to their symptoms and reduces their symptoms. I would take that as suggestive of visual stress. I don't think it's a common symptom because it wasn't identified in the Delphi study. But any study like a Delphi study is not going to cover every individual case. And so I'd take that as suggestive. In my experience, most of those would have had some of the symptoms that would be listed in the Delphi criteria as well. So I think that's quite likely. As an aside, really, when manufacturers make paper, they put whiteners in it to make it whiter than white. And if we all use recycled paper, which tends to be much less white and slightly grey, I think it would help a lot of children considerably, as well as being good for the environment.
Thank you, Bruce.